Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS, is one type of cloud service delivery model. It's a cloud service model that really focuses on the underlying infrastructure that supports IT services. Now, when we talk about underlying infrastructure, what kinds of things are we talking about? Well, first of all of the underlying infrastructure is hosted in a data center. And IaaS resources are configured by IT sysadmins. We're really talking about deploying and managing network configurations in Azure, network security configurations, storage configurations, compute, such as in the form of virtual machines. And the other thing we have to think about is the service level agreement, or SLA, for each of these types of IaaS services. The service level agreement will provide details related to guaranteed uptime for each of these services. Azure data centers house all of the equipment that provides the infrastructure on which Azure services run. However, Azure data center locations are not disclosed for security reasons. And there is at least one Azure data center per availability zone, or AZ. When you deploy and manage some Azure resources, you will have the option of specifying an availability zone where you want something placed. So an availability zone then is within an Azure region, and it consists of one data center or more in larger urban centers. So it provides redundancy at the power level, network level, and equipment rack level as well. Microsoft Azure data centers are also secured physically in terms of perimeter fencing, lighting, biometric authentication to the data center, and so on. So with Azure IaaS, we are talking about a shared responsibility model. Part of that responsibility falls upon Microsoft in terms of making sure the underlying infrastructure in the data center, that they are secure, that it is redundant, and it is kept up and running, that it's available. But on the other hand, if we have a customer that is deploying a virtual machine as IaaS, then it is the customer's responsibility to configure and manage that virtual machine. That means determining how remote accessibility to the virtual machine is handled for management, and also the application of software patches for the OS running in the virtual machine, whether it's Windows or Linux-based, and also patches for any software that might have been added to the virtual machine. So the cloud service provider, or the CSP, is responsible for the underlying hypervisors, network equipment, physical storage arrays, and the cloud customer or tenant would be responsible for the VM deployment and management, virtual networks, storage provisioning, and so on. There are many examples of Azure Infrastructure as a Service offerings, one of which is a storage account. You can deploy one or more Microsoft Azure storage accounts in different regions. You can even enable replication between regions for increased high availability. And you can allow users permissions to upload and download content to and from a storage account, or perhaps it's done programmatically by a software component. You might also use a storage account for software development purposes using message queuing, where one software component can drop a message into a queue that's later read by another software component. So there are many uses of storage accounts. Now, it's infrastructure as a service because storage is considered infrastructure. We also can deploy virtual network configurations, VNets in other words, where we specify an IP address range, whether it's IPv4 or IPv6, that's used by the subnets defined within the virtual network. The subnets are where you actually deploy resources like virtual machines, and the IP address range that's allocated for the subnet needs to fall within the virtual network, and that IP address range determines the IPs that are assigned to deployed resources in that subnet, like virtual machines. So, of course, virtual machines are considered infrastructure as a service when you deploy them manually, not to be confused with virtual machines that are automatically provisioned with other services in Microsoft Azure, like Azure Functions. So we're talking about the manual deployment of VMs being infrastructure as a service. Then there are other offerings, maybe related to security, like Azure Firewall, which we can associate with an Azure VNet to control traffic into and out of that virtual network. So there are plenty of different types of examples of how to work with IaaS solutions in Microsoft Azure. So compared to deploying IT services on premises manually, what benefits are provided in the cloud using IaaS? The first one is accessibility from anywhere. One of the definitions of cloud computing, remember, is that the services should be available over a network, whether that's a local area network, whether it's through a wide area network, such as the internet or a dedicated WAN connection. Another benefit is less provisioning time than if we were manually deploying, for instance, virtual machines. In a cloud computing environment, self-provisioning is one characteristic, which allows cloud customers or users to provision resources at the command line or the GUI very quickly without involving the IT department. We know that there's a shared responsibility in cloud computing. In the case of infrastructure as a service, part of that responsibility lies with the provider and the other with the cloud customer or tenant. We can manage Azure infrastructure as a service offerings using GUI management through the Azure portal, the web interface, or using the Azure CLI or the Azure PowerShell environment where we can issue commandlets. Programmers can also issue programmatic API calls over the REST API to control various Azure services. And finally, we can also use ARM templates. Template is a blueprint that has the details contained within it on which resources should be deployed into Azure, such as all of the resources required to support a web application, like the app service, the web app itself, perhaps a storage account, maybe a load balancer, and a content delivery network configuration.